Okay, so for ligaments, let's see 7 here. And this is really fascia, so if we peeled off a little layer, okay, but for the sake of the models that we have in-house here, this is where I would ask you these. From C7 up, you've got a ligament that connects the spinous processes, so it's continuous, and that's going to be your ligamentum nuchae. From C7 down, connecting those spinous processes, you would have the supraspinous ligament. Now, if we looked at 2 adjacent vertebrae, so here I've got 2 examples of vertebral units. Of course, they're missing discs, but it's just to illustrate the point. So if we have 2 adjacent vertebrae here with their disc in between, you would also have ligaments between the adjacent spinous processes. So here on the tips would be the supraspinous, but actually in between 2 adjacent spinous processes, you would have the interspinal ligaments. You would also have the same kind of deal between adjacent transverse processes, and that would be intertransverse ligaments. So supraspinous on the tips, interspinal actually in between. So that's not going to be continuous ligament. So between these 2 would be an interspinal ligament, between the next 2 would be an interspinal ligament, interspinal, interspinal, interspinal. Here would be intertransverse. Now think, those are posterior, so they're going to restrict excessive forward flexion. Here, these would restrict excessive lateral flexion in the opposite direction unilaterally, and then bilaterally they'd also provide some assistance in restricting excessive forward flexion. Now, we also have 2 ligaments called your longitudinal ligaments. So we're looking at the anterior surface of the spine right here. So you'd have a ligament that ran all the way up, all the way down. That's going to be your anterior longitudinal. It's continuous, longitudinal. If we look at the inside of the vertebral foramen, so the inside here, on the bodies here, that's going to be your posterior longitudinal. So you have a posterior here and anterior here, and they run all the way up and down the spine. They hug the bodies. Posterior longitudinal, anterior longitudinal. The last one we're going to cover on the inside of the vertebral foramen, again, not against the body, on this surface, connecting the 2 adjacent vertebrae, you're going to have the ligamentum flavum. So we're talking about from the inside of the lamina here to the inside of the lamina here on the next one. That's the ligamentum flavum. That is not a continuous ligament. You would see it, a little ligament like that, for each vertebral unit, all the way up, all the way down. Ligamentum flavum. Those are the main spinal ligaments we're going to cover in this class. Think about your anterior and longitudinal. That's going to restrict excessive extension. But the rest of those, they are really posterior, and they're going to prevent excessive forward flexion, which is where gravity is pulling. So think you're going to have a lot more structural support back here, muscular and ligamentous, fascia, all those supportive structures, to help combat gravity, because gravity is always pulling you forward into flexion, and you need strong extensors and strong other structural supports to help maintain an erect spine. All right, that's the ligaments that we'll cover for this exam.